that you're diminishing your identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to be a negative process. And I guess it's how do we not only create try to take vainglory out from ourselves, but also, in a way, encourage a community atmosphere that's not so individualistic and me and my identity, without depleting what some people may think is their sense of identity.
I think you're really asking a question about how to create countercultural communities of affirmation. Why do we need public identity affirmation? Why do we need to do this on Twitter? And to what extent are we not doing that in face-to-face personal relationships that are deep and lasting? I just wonder about time allocation. How much time do we spend on our public persona versus our friendships, for example? What would it look like to create a culture of genuine celebration rather than empty praise? I mean, and I ask that question seriously. I mean, so if I go to a concert, for example, and I want to express appreciation, I need a way of speaking that appreciation so that it's heard as appreciation and not as like, wah, wah, fandom, right? Where the expectation isn't so ramped up that the person feels like they have to fake it in order to achieve what's expected of them by their fans. And I think we can start small with this in the way that we learn to affirm each other. I mean, someone asked me in a vainglory lecture, no less, what do you do when everybody claps at the end? What do you say? What do you say when you do something that's appreciated? And do you say, thank you very much, you know, sort of Elvis style, like, whoa, I'm so awesome. Or do you say, I'm so grateful that what I shared with you was helpful tonight? I mean, it's just a subtle difference. I think we can signal to each other the fact that we're taking in that praise as encouragement, and we're not taking it as, wow, I'm such a celebrity now, you know, or next time I expect the same applause, right? I mean, here's an interesting, I think we have a kind of rhythm to shoot for here. If you're in the limelight, if you're getting affirmation publicly on a pretty regular basis, I think you probably need to find places of solitude and silence to counterbalance that. So when I think about practices like fasting and feasting in the church year, you do a long Lenten fast, and then you have an Easter feast. You have an Advent fast, you do a Christmas feast. There's this kind of rhythm of back and forth, fasting and feasting. And it strikes me that we might think creatively about how to do something similar with vainglory. If you're in a very attention-getting set of practices, maybe you need to get out into a non-attention-seeking set of practices. So what I do, for example, is after I give a lecture like this, I go home to my kids, who could care less about anything I do and who don't applaud me ever, okay? You know, and there's a sense in which, I know I'm kind of being facetious, but at the same time, there's a sense in which it's good to go back to communities in which you're not a star. Nobody cares about your resume. You're just a person. You're just a member of the family, and everyone's going to treat you like that. And that's a kind of healthy counterbalance. So for me, it's definitely not silent at home or solitary, but it's a community where I am treated as just one of the rest of us, and not treated as, oh, I'm a professor with a PhD and blah, 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 you know. So just kind of take that hat off for a while and try to be without it. So, I mean, there is a sense in which we can't help but create a public identity. That's just part of the world we live in. You will be saying something, whether you try to or not. But we can also find places where we step back from that. And then as a counterbalance, I think also create communities in which the affirmation is genuine encouragement and gratitude giving to God. I can honestly say I have friends, and their goodness is something that I'm so grateful for because it teaches me how to be good. So it's a kind of witnessing to each other. And we're grateful for witnessing in a way that isn't shallow applause-like. And I think we need, as a Christian community, to be able to articulate that kind of affirmation as well, that kind of glory giving. Yes?
I was intrigued by the week of
Silence.
self self-talking. And I'm wondering if you've tried any experiments along those lines with prayer, fasting from self-talking prayer.
I have not, but now I'm going to. Thank you. That was a wonderful idea. So the question was, in our week of practicing silencing our self-talk, to think about doing that during our praying as well, sort of not presenting me and my requests to God, but sort of listening to God and receiving what He has to offer, or maybe even offering up prayers for others, petitionary prayer. That's an intriguing idea. I'm going to definitely take you up on that. Thank you for that suggestion. I have tried other practices in class with respect to sort of pulling away from things and learning to practice things. And some are more successful than others. So here's a place for you guys to go out and be creative and try some of this stuff on your own.
Dallas Willard talks about two different kinds of disciplines. He talks about the disciplines of abstinence and then also the disciplines of engagement. And the disciplines of abstinence are meant to break our unhealthy spiritual relationships with things in order to engage in more positive ways with the world and with our body in relationship with God. And so I was wondering, especially in relation to a subject that is so self-conscious of my own thoughts, what is in our practice of putting self to death, related to the issue of vainglory, what is it that we positively replace it with, so that we're not just kind of experiencing a kind of vainglorious paranoia.
That's a great way to put it, vainglorious paranoia. Yeah, so if silence and solitude help us pull away or detach from a disordered love of glory, what do we use to fill in the positive side? What do we use to focus our attention on? I think there's an interesting relationship to the positive practices that go with overcoming envy here. And this is sort of an exploratory thought, but let me say this much. I think what happens when we're absorbed with the goodness of something other than the self is a lack of self-concern, a lack of focus. And I'll just give you an example. When I'm teaching sometimes, I'll get so wrapped up in what I'm talking about that I'll lose track of time. I won't, realize that, I've chalk dust on the side of my jacket. It's like you're not focused on the self at all. You're focused on some good that is all absorbing. Now that good can be, sometimes it can be the good of others. I think of the way that a parent is attentive to a newborn. There's a kind of absorption in the goodness of the other. There's a kind of focus of attention that the self just recedes to the background. And so with respect to envy too, one of the positive ways that getting rid of envy and vainglory frees us to focus is on what the tradition calls zeal, being inspired by the example of others. And this is a kind of genuine celebration of other people's goodness. And if you're envious, you can't do this. But if you've gotten over envy to some extent, you're secure in God's love for you, you can be inspired. You can be absorbed by, you can be caught up in goodness that is outside the self, transcendent goodness, beautiful art, beautiful music, the inspiring examples of others. And that's a moment when you experience glory-free celebration. Vainglory-free celebration, where the goodness itself is right front and center and the self is somewhere lost from view. So how do you engage in those kinds of practices? I mean, I think you would need to tap into what your particular passions are and your gifts are, and then thinking about the ways in which those can be cultivated by attention on the goods involved and not on the self. But even going into that project as an intentional thing, as you notice, is sort of fraught with self-consciousness, intentionality. And vainglory runs into the same kind of trickiness that humility does on that score. You can't think too much about being humble, or it ruins everything. Yeah, same idea. Good question.
You had mentioned in that week of silence that in the silence there's it drew then dialogue that people might not have shared, and it started me thinking, you mentioned also several times the idea of fasting from sort of self-justification and excuses, and Richard Foster and Dallas Willard talk about that sort of guarding we do of our reputation.
Yeah.
And I thought of another sort of in that silence of not seeking to constantly self-justify, God's action of protecting our reputation in ways that he sort of comes to our aid, ways we might be misunderstood, and when we don't rush to fill in the explanation, he's actually able to show himself faithful and explain ourselves, even to ourselves, better than we could, and certainly to others. That's sort of a way we experience his ministry to us, and another thing I think that sort of comes into that gap when we can stop talking so much. But I didn't know if you had other things you thought sort of come into the...
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that insight. That's definitely, that's a testimony of God doing for us sometimes better than what we try to do for ourselves. And that's a gift to be received as well. I would say the other thing that I think, and this is sort of the discipline side of the spiritual disciplines, there's certainly a freedom that you gain through discipline, but it often feels like discipline. So let me say this about that example. There will be, and there were places where we were not allowed to justify, make excuses, tell the story our way, put our own spin on it, and that involved suffering. And it just plain involved suffering. It involved being misunderstood, it involved people thinking less of us or whatever. And for us, that was a moment. It was a kind of Abba Macarius and learn from the dead moment. Ultimately, what has to matter most is what God knows about my heart and about who I am. And there are going to be times when you are misread and misunderstood. And hopefully it's times when you're doing the right thing, right? And you're misunderstood as being less than what you are. And I think that's just good Christian practice for living in the world. And I think sometimes we're trying too hard to be liked by the world. The church is too caught up in, we need to do the marketing thing, we need everybody to like Christians and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think sometimes we do without the world's approval. And that's called being faithful. So there's a sense in which that has to be part of the project as well, although I'm just affirm your sense that God will step in and sometimes and give us the affirmation we need, and sometimes teach other people what to see in us that way too. I mean, we all know people, don't we, who are more concerned with their integrity than with the show. And we know these people, and we respect these people. So there is a kind of witness that comes with being faithful, even when it's not popular. And I think that's an attractive witness too. Sometimes takes a little longer to cultivate, and there's some suffering in the meantime. Yes?
I don't want to climb over people. The whole issue of self-image. And today there's so many people whose self-image is so poor that in a vain way they'll go sit in a corner and hide in the crowd. Could you just comment on that?
Sure. I mean, for every good thing, we can mess it up. And there's a sense in which you can kind of do this in the reverse psychology way, like, I'm so pathetic sitting in the corner. Can't you see how much I need you to come over here and affirm me? It's like Gaston moping in the tavern, right? I'm so glum. Everybody noticing how glum I am? Come cheer me up. It's kind of fishing for compliments type of dynamic. And it is a kind of, I think it's a needy form of vainglory. The question is, what's the remedy? Is the remedy more human affirmation? Or is it learning to ground your worth, your identity your love, your need for love and recognition, and ultimately what the Lord says. Now, that said, let me just echo a point from a great article by Robin Dillon on self-respect. She says, one of the ways we learn to respect ourselves is by being respected by others. And I don't want that point to get lost here either. I think the Christian church, the Christian family, the Christian community like this college, it's part of our job to affirm each other in the right way, in healthy ways. We learn God's love language from each other. We learn it from our parents, we learn it from our church. And when we don't hear God's voice in them, we're living in a place of pain and suffering. And I don't want to say that we have an ultimate human fix for that. If we could just get our communities better organized and whatever, it would all be solved, because ultimately it's got to be God's voice that we're hearing through other people. Like Augustine, hearing God's affirmation through seeing the lives of his congregation and seeing his work bear fruit. That's genuinely affirming. But at the same time, discerning when we're hearing God through others and when we're not. That is a tough deal. And I don't pretend to have any good formulaic answers of how that goes. But I do think it's important, I think it's incumbent on us as a Christian community to be good affirmers of others as well, and to teach them about God's love through our loving as well, and honest loving. That is one of the hard things, isn't it? You know, you can only take a hard word from a good friend. You need a secure basis of affirmation to hear truth from. And the Christian community is called to speak the truth in love. We're called to do both. And that means we've got to be really serious about our love so that we can be really serious about being truthful. And they have to go together.
That's a great turn at which to say, can we express our appreciation and gratitude once more?
Thank you very much.